Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on racism, nativism, and immigration policy. The learning goals for this week are: how does the history of U.S. immigration policy reflect racism and nativism? How has U.S. policy responded to undocumented immigration? And what is the relationship between nativism and racism in the 21st century? So first, we start with definitions. What is nativism? Nativism favors the allocation of resources to native-born citizens over immigrants and promotes a fear of foreign cultures. Racist nativism is where nativist sentiments are directed at particular racial groups. Now, the reading talked about the racialized history of U.S. immigration, starting with the 1790 naturalization law that only allowed free white persons to become citizens. Then in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese from immigrating to the United States. In 1924, the Immigration Act instituted quotas on the number of people that could come from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1930s, we had the mass deportations of Mexicans, as we talked about previously, whether they were citizens or not. In 1954, we have a similar situation happen with Operation Wetback, and this was connected to the culture of the time that was very fearful around communism and was looking to basically oust and get rid of people who had any affiliation with the Communist Party, whether real or imagined. This was connected to the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, which was a law designed to combat communism. It required members of the Communist Party in the United States to register with the federal government, and it allowed for the deportation of foreign nationals who were members of the Communist Party. So many of the people who were deported during this time period were deported under this law and under accusations that they were communists, and that's why they were being deported. This changed in 1965 through the Immigration and Nationality Act, which did away with racially based quotas and set a universal quota of 20,000 immigrants for every country in the world. And this act, which is also known as the Hart-Celler Act, resulted in increased immigration from Asia and Latin America and increased undocumented immigration from Mexico. Now, in this chart, we see immigrations as a total number and as a percentage of the US population. So while the blue line demonstrates that we have a large number of immigrants, this is immigrants, this is not necessarily undocumented people. The percentage of immigrants as a percentage of the entire US population is really closer to 15%, okay? So think about that when we're hearing rhetoric around, the supposed hordes of immigrants that are coming and crossing the border. This figure shows the distribution of the population of undocumented immigrants in the United States in 2017. As you can see, 47% of undocumented migrants in the United States came from Mexico, 18% from Central America, and 14% from Asia. The reading talked about the reasons for why immigrants have come from different parts of Asia and Latin America, so I won't repeat those here. But what you'll see in the reading is that immigrants from these regions have been vital members of the workforce in the United States, and many have come as a result of US intervention in these countries. As the reading discussed, concerns over illegal immigration did not exist until the 1980s, during an economic downturn in the US and an increase in the arrival of people from Latin America. Politicians began to talk about illegal immigration as a source of economic and social problems in the United States, resulting in the policies that have come about since then. And these are some of the most impactful ones. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which provided legalization for some undocumented migrants, while also providing sections for employers of undocumented migrants. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996 expanded the grounds for deportation and narrowed grounds for appeals. In California, we saw Proposition 187 making it to the ballot there, which was an initiative to deny social services and educational opportunities to undocumented immigrants. The media was used to promote ideas of Mexicans as illegal immigrants and criminals, and undocumented immigrants were used as scapegoats for economic downturn in California, even though there was no evidence of a connection between what was going on in the economy in California at the time and undocumented immigrants. So here you really see this nativist sentiment arising where there was this sense that social services, health services, educational services, and so on should only be provided to native-born citizens. Then we had the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which denied welfare services to non-citizens who were legal immigrants. Contrary to popular belief, undocumented migrants have never been eligible for welfare benefits. Their American-born children, however, are eligible as any other American citizens. This law extended limitations to welfare benefits to legal immigrants as well. And finally, we have the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which eliminated judicial review of some deportation orders and required mandatory detention for many non-citizens. Here we see the US immigration population by origin, where we see, of course, the numbers of people coming from Mexico, South and East Asia, Europe and Canada, and other Latin American countries. And here we see the top 10 countries to which deportees were sent in 2014. These 10 nations represent 97.81% of people deported in 2014. Here we see unauthorized immigrants are a quarter of the US foreign-born population, okay? Not the entire population, but only of all those who are foreign-born who are in the United States. A quarter of those people are undocumented, okay? Now, how do you get deported? Right? Well, you can be deported for being out of status, or you can be deported for committing a crime. Any legal permanent resident convicted of a crime for which the sentence is more than 1 year faces deportation, okay? Any legal permanent resident. So these laws, all deportation laws, also affect those that are here legally. If at any point in their time period of living in the United States, they ever committed any kind of crime for which the sentence is more than 1 year, they can face deportation, even if they've been living in the country legally. So any non-citizen can be deported if they violate the terms of their visa or residency. Deportable offenses include 2 counts of illegal drug possession, any crime of violence, including resisting arrest, assault, or attempted arson. These do not require judicial review, so the individual does not get an opportunity to explain themselves and have their particular case looked at. And deportable offenses are retroactive, meaning that if your offense was committed before these regulations were put in place and you are caught by ICE, you can still be deported, okay? Now, the reading also talked about racism in the criminal justice system, as we talked about earlier, but in relation to immigration. So even though Black and white men have similar levels of criminal activity, Black men are 7 times more likely than white men to be imprisoned, and Latinos are 4 times as likely. About 1/3 of all deportees are deported for drug charges, and most deportees are men. So relate that to when we talked about the impacts on the family, when we talked about African Americans and Latinos who are in jail. and the impact that it has on their children, on their families, and so on. We see a similar case happening here with people who are being deported. Racial profiling, of course, is part of immigration law enforcement. You have ICE fugitive operations agents that can arrest anyone they suspect to be an undocumented migrant. And the reading also talked about the 1975 court decision, United States versus Brignoni Ponce, which authorized the Border Patrol to rely on quote unquote Mexican appearance when deciding whom to interrogate. We have also seen more recent state laws that have been passed with similar kinds of regulations of being able to basically racially profile who you're stopping and who you're asking for documentation. There were slightly more undocumented Chinese and Filipinos in the US than Hondurans in 2007. However, nearly 25,000 Hondurans were deported for being out of status as compared to 408 Filipinos and 766 Chinese. And this goes back to how we are profiling who is an undocumented immigrant, right? It's become synonymous with Latinos. And so when police officers or ICE officers are looking who to interrogate or ask about their documentation, they're targeting Latinos because that's become the stereotypical, right, image of who an undocumented immigrant is. And they're not necessarily targeting other populations that also have undocumented people in the United States. So Black and brown immigrants are more likely to be deported. Undocumented Mexicans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, and Salvadorians are more likely to be targeted in worksite and home raids than undocumented Asians and Europeans because of, again, these stereotypes of who is considered undocumented. Lawful permanent residents from Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico are more likely to be deported on criminal grounds than Vietnamese, Indian, or Chinese folks with the same status, because again of these stereotypes about Black and Latino criminality and who is undocumented. So is the differential treatment of Black and Latino immigrants in the US a reflection of structural racism? Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro explain it is not necessary for laws to use explicitly racial language to reproduce racial inequalities. Insofar as laws, policies, and institutions create inequitable outcomes in their implementation, they can be considered part of the structural racism that has pervaded US society since its inception. So we no longer have, all of those immigration policies that I went over before. None of them say in their policies that these are targeting a particular racial or ethnic group, like those earlier policies of the 1800s and so on, with like the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act is named the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? It was very overtly racialized. The newer policies don't specifically name any particular racial group that is being targeted, but when you look at the outcomes, when you look at who is actually being impacted, that's where you see these discrepancies show up. The reading also talked about, how do we see contemporary racialized nativism? George Sanchez suggests that 3 factors distinguish contemporary racialized nativism from that of a century ago. You see this in the rise of extreme aversion toward languages other than English, the worry that Asian, Caribbean, and Latin American immigrants are taking advantage of affirmative action programs designed to help native-born minorities, especially African Americans, and the concern that immigrants are draining public resources through the use of welfare, education, and healthcare services. And I would also add this concern that we constantly hear about now of immigrants coming and taking American jobs. So in conclusion, we continue to see both the racially uneven consequences of immigration laws and racialized sentiments directed at particular national origin racial groups. As the number of non-white immigrants has increased since 1965, we have seen increasingly harsh and restrictive immigration laws and proposals. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your comments in the discussion posts. Have a good week.